Tony, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Salem Hall. Really appreciate you coming out tonight. My name is Tim Pickering. I'm president of the Board of Trustees of the Pickering Foundation, and it's an honor to welcome you here tonight. I want to thank the other two sponsors of tonight's presentation, Hamilton Hall, their Board of Trustees, has been very gracious about letting us in, bringing us in, welcoming us warmly. And their executive director, Donna Fritz, has made it very easy for us to plan this program. And I also want to thank the Friends of Broad Street Cemetery, who've been with us supporting Kenneth and Joseph's work all year. And it's been a great privilege for the Pickering Foundation to do that work. I want to lay out how the evening will work. Ambassador Pickering will speak first. We're so fortunate to have him here and in our extended family, and are grateful for every opportunity to hear him speak and learn from his perspective. And then Kenneth and Joseph will speak about the work they're doing in Ukraine, and the bulk of your ticket sales will go directly to support their humanitarian work there. Then MSNBC anchor Yasmin Vossoughian will join us. She's on her way here now from Logan, and will lead a Q&A discussion with our speakers and take some questions. Yasmin is an Emmy Award-winning journalist and has years of international reporting experience. And then we'll conclude the reception here in the hall with food and drink provided by all three of our sponsor organizations. And special thanks I want to give to Svetlana Rozgun, who is here tonight, and providing mulled cider and Ukrainian cookies. Mulled wine, that's how to say. Linda Jenkins has been the executive director of the Pickering Foundation for the past 12 years, and in that time, she and her husband Tim have helped our board see how we can better serve the Salem community, and they are also the creative thinking and energy behind tonight's program. We would not be here tonight without Linda's work and leadership, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce her and get our evening started. Thank you.
Wow. You know, I've come to the lectures before, but I've never been in this spot, so this is very interesting. Thank you to Tim Pickering and to our Board of Trustees, the Board of Trustees of Hamilton Hall, and to all the volunteers at the Friends of Broad Street Cemetery. And most of all, thanks to Career Ambassador Thomas Pickering for coming up here from Washington to lead us this evening. A little bit about Ambassador Pickering. In her book, Lessons from the Edge, former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, recalls a time early in her career when she was working at Embassy Moscow with Ambassador Pickering, and she writes, "Wickedly smart, Ambassador Pickering had a phenomenal memory and seemed to have a system for just about everything on the policy side or otherwise. For staying awake during boring meetings, he recommended digging your nails into the palm of your hand or chewing on the inside of your cheek, techniques I found painful but effective. Pickering seemed to work around the clock, and rumor had it that he had so mastered the skill of power napping that he required only a few hours of sleep a night. Well over 6 feet tall, he was a man in a hurry. And I quickly learned that I wouldn't be able to keep up unless I wore flats so that I could trot along beside him." Ambassador Pickering has served more than 4 decades as a U.S. diplomat, as U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation, India, Israel, El Salvador, Nigeria, and Jordan. He was also U.S. ambassador and representative to the United Nations in New York, where he led the U.S. effort to build a coalition in the UN Security Council during and after the First Gulf War. He last served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the 3rd highest post in the U.S. State Department. There used to be an old commercial that said, "When E.F. Hutton talks, people listen." That's even more true of Thomas Pickering. I hope you enjoy this evening and have lots of questions. Please join me in welcoming Career Ambassador Pickering.
Thank you, Linda and Tim, and all of you for coming. And thank you very much for your very warm welcome. I thought that I would spend a few minutes talking about the historic relationship, or maybe now non-relationship, between Russia and Ukraine. I'd spend a little more time on Mr. Putin and his motivations and some of what's going on now in Russia. I think that Joseph and Kenneth are going to want to talk about Ukraine, and I would welcome hearing what they have to say, and am delighted that they will be part of this evening's program as well. I was in Ukraine only on one trip back in the early 90s, but developed an admiration for the people, a deep sense of the importance of what was going on, and indeed the significance of Ukraine in that part of the world. I'll talk a little bit about what it is we might expect as a result of the ongoing conflict, ways forward, if not ways out. But I will certainly warn you that I am not optimistic, nor am I in any way at all enthused about the notion that we will see an outcome in the very near future. But let me also say that I spent a good 7 years of my diplomatic career in the Middle East, and was the first American who served as ambassador in an Arab country similarly to so serve in Israel. I started as a result of Schizophrenics Club. It's important to note that the Middle East, unfortunately, is punctuated by conflicts. And the most important, I think, thing about that is that wise people have used the tragedy of conflict to see if they can move the diplomatic ball forward toward peaceful solution. We are a long way from that. But the beginning of an effort on the part of the international community to understand that ferocious continued warlike actions and death and destruction are getting nowhere and have little to offer. And I'm afraid I say the same about the Ukraine-Russia conflict. It seems to me that there's an opportunity. And on the day after the death of Henry Kissinger, someone I worked for through the last large Middle East conflict, and watched him to develop the efforts he made to bring peace between Egypt and Israel, and then later with Jordan, were extremely important. I'm happy to cover questions tonight if we get in any way at all fatigued about the problem of Ukraine and Russia, about the Middle East. But I cannot at this stage be very optimistic about that. With those few words of introduction, let me swing right into what it is that I have to tell you, beginning with the notion that Russia and Ukraine are close brotherly states, countries whose language is Slavic, whose language is very close together, whose history is intertwined, beginning in the 10th century, when Christianity found its way in to the area to the north of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. Two Greek monks, now sainted, at least in the Orthodox Church, Cyril and Methodius, spent part of their lives of contemplation and devising an alphabet based very heavily on the Greek alphabet to record Russian and certainly Ukrainian. It's a fascinating thing to see that also when they ran out of Greek sounds for Russian expletives, they went back to Hebrew for 2 letters. So in effect, Christianity came out of the Middle East to the north. It was in the Orthodox tradition of the faith. Many differences from the practice of both Catholics and Protestants, but nevertheless many similarities. And it was Prince Vladimir of Kiev who took the major step of bringing his state into Christianity. And it is fascinating that in my last trip to Moscow, one of the great changes I noticed at the edge of a major boulevard with an entry into the Kremlin alongside it was a large statue of Prince Vladimir, courtesy of Prince Vladimir Putin. And that recognition was, of course, betrayed by his invasion of Ukraine, and indeed the deep tradition that had otherwise connected Christianity in the 2 countries. There were many historical periods in which Islamic influence was quite significant in the North Shore of the Black Sea. And it is very interesting to note that there is a Turkish community that practices Orthodox Christianity on the North Shore of the Black Sea, almost up against the Romanian border. Just to tell you how and in what way the differences that tend to prevail in that part of the world are also in some ways negated by the opportunities. And it is, of course, something that those of us who thought about diplomacy over the years have always thought that the great opportunity is for diplomacy to turn challenges into opportunities. And unfortunately, both in the Russia-Ukraine region and in the Middle East today, we have a fertile field, an unrelieved offering. I will not say gift, because it would betray my deep sense of feeling about the tragedy that continues every day and the great loss of human lives in that part of the world. And the notion that that is not a necessity, it is not yet an opportunity, unfortunately, but it is clearly a great tragedy. Over the years, the Russian monarchical empire of the Tsars became the major political organization to the east of Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. More and more land was taken, some from Turks, some from the Islamic states of Central Asia, some in the Baltic region, and some on the borders of Eastern Europe. A great empire arose and was in many ways extinguished by a revolution in 1917 which introduced communism to that part of the world. I won't dwell at great length, but I will say that Ukraine was in its own way, unfortunately, forcibly incorporated in the move toward communism. And that Ukrainians suffered in the early 30s Holodomor, the Ukrainian word for their Holocaust, the catastrophe they had when the lack of food, when rampant famine held sway in their country, dominated as it was by Joseph Stalin, who saw this as part of the mechanism of establishing more complete control over Ukraine. During the Second World War, Ukraine was the centerpiece of many of the most difficult and trying battles. Ukrainians paid a high price for the Second World War and emerged from the Second World War in a situation where reconstruction and rebuilding was the order of the day. The Soviet Union, in its own fashion, did what needed to be done, not, I think, with unrelieved joy, but with the notion that Ukraine was and was going to become, in their vision in Moscow, a centerpiece of new technological advances and construction. And so Ukraine was one of the production centers of missiles under the Soviet Union, and it remains in that regard capable and, in every sense of the word, engaged in doing so today. President Putin's invasion was not expected, I believe, by the large majority of people around the globe. American intelligence, we now know, knew a good bit about what might be on the verge of happening. And for the first time, the United States intelligence system began to brief in ways that we had not seen before other countries about what was gathering on the Russian side that should be seen as a threat to the independence, the peaceful state, and the growth of Ukraine. Ukraine was a country which had its own problems. To be brutally frank, Ukraine was in many ways still suffering the problem of corruption. And this was not an easy task to take on for new leadership. Ukraine went through 3 or 4 changes of leadership with the disappearance of the largely post-war dominated Ukrainian government. Ukraine, during my service in Russia, was asked, importuned, I will even say pressured, to give up the large store of Soviet nuclear weapons stationed on its territory in order to avoid creating a new phase of nuclear proliferation in a world that, from our point of view, already had too much. That particular arrangement was made on the basis that both Russia, post-Soviet Russia, and the United States would be committed in a very serious way to coming to its aid were any state able to threaten it in a way that might bring about its extinction as a state. That particular commitment broke in pieces at the time of the Russian invasion. There have remained deep concerns over the continuation of the conflict that indeed threats by President Putin to introduce nuclear weapons use could come to pass and would lead to a catastrophe, not just for Ukraine, which would be the first and probably the state greatest to suffer irreparable damage were that to happen, but large pieces of the globe. And one doesn't know, but Mr. Putin certainly understands that the prevailing climate movements in the atmosphere across Ukraine almost always blow in the direction of Russia. One can only hope that he understands that Russia, therefore, has no immunity from fallout and from serious damage, particularly to the population of Russia, were nuclear weapons to be used. Where are we now, and what might be in the future? The hardest question is the future. The easiest question is to describe where we are now in terms of an answer, but finding a way to turn now to the future is extremely taxing for even the most brilliant of diplomats, negotiators, mediators, facilitators, go-betweeners. If I can, let me do my best to be as frankly honest as I can. My emotions lie with the country that was attacked, and I see no reason why, in effect, that attack was in any way justified. But let me, if I can, separate my emotions from an evaluation of the present situation in order to talk a little bit about where the future might go. Ukraine, we had all hoped, would conduct a very significant offensive in the period beginning in the late spring through the summer and the autumn. They mobilized a great deal of force, brought to bear a large amount of committed military pressure. They succeeded in making small advances and in blocking any serious Russian effort at a military riposte to take more territories. They did not succeed in the kind of offensive that we thought might parallel what happened in the earlier stages of the war in late 2021 and early 2022, where large numbers of Russian troops moved away from Kyiv, from Kharkiv, from the border north and south, along the eastern edge of Ukraine. And while they had ambitions to be able at least to separate the Russian Federation forces from Crimea by driving through to the Black Sea coast, that has so far evaded them. They have managed a number of surprise attacks and commando-type activities, as well as missile attacks against Crimea, but nothing of a permanent situation has taken place, and they have succeeded in interrupting the flow of traffic from time to time over the 12-mile bridge that connects eastern Crimea with western Russia across the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea, but not on a permanent basis. This is a situation which we all think is beginning to show signs of a stalemate. And many have believed that it is only through a stalemate that a cessation of the murderous hostilities can take place. And a stalemate and a cessation of hostilities is clearly neither desired nor in many ways in the strategic plans of either President Putin of Russia or President Zelensky of Ukraine. They both hope that they will be able so to use their military forces to create a situation on the ground where either they can point to victory, and that will be apparent for all to see and recognizable and translatable into more than a march down a capital street to something that will resolve the territorial question, which is not the only issue, but perhaps the primary point of difference between Russia and Ukraine in their favor. That so far has evaded each side. The Russians showed real weakness in the early period of 2022 when they were forced to evacuate big pieces that they had taken of northern and eastern Ukraine. But since that particular period of time, the fighting has been intense. It has been very engaged. Ukraine has made some significant but not large-scale increases in territorial acquisition to recover its own land, but it has not yet so developed a military position that the answer is that the two parties may be willing to come to the table against the backdrop of one side, Ukraine, having the leverage that it needs to be able to negotiate a solution. Where could this go? I find it difficult to see that there is any kind of cessation of combat short of a significant gain on the part of one side or another. And even then, the knowledge I have of the determination of President Putin and what I see of President Zelensky from the distance that we have to observe him does not lead me to believe that that will happen anytime soon. That means that in the interim period, there are very few things that can be done to relieve the issue. What has been done has been prisoner exchanges, which are also important to both sides. What has been done has been, first, an agreement about allowing Ukrainian grain to come to the world market because many developing countries depend upon that grain supply. And thirdly, but in a much less defined and looser way, some attention paid to the notion that the nuclear power plant in south-central Ukraine at Zaporizhzhia, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, if not the world, needs to be handled with a great deal of care and consideration. And some of that is taking place, not to the point where I believe anyone can say it's satisfactory in any way at all, but not to the point where it seems so uncaringly negligent that it will bring on a radiation catastrophe for large shares of the population. And so we hope, in fact, that that stays that way, but there is no certainty. These steps on the side are not yet things that can be developed into an effort to bring about a cessation of hostilities, much less the negotiation of a peaceful resolution of the differences. And we know that from other conflicts, the two do not necessarily follow one from the other, but that having a cessation of hostilities is a major consideration for all who have any concern, as they must have, that the extinction of human life in a conflict is a tragedy beginning with the first person that loses the life and extending into thousands and tens of thousands is clearly beyond what we could all, in any way at all, as matters at least of morals and ethics, adopt as a strategic direction for the conflict or the outcome. And this, of course, is controversial and very difficult. And that we also know that each side has ambitions in a territorial sense that are equal to the other side's, but in exactly the opposite direction. Putin wants all of Ukraine, and in my view, probably Moldova, which is not a member of a military alliance which could help provide it with the kind of protection it needs. And President Zelensky wishes, quite rightly, to recover the lost territory of Crimea and the oblasts that are under partial or whole Russian military occupation. We don't have an answer to that other than our continued commitment to support militarily Ukrainian forces in the defense and reacquisition of their homeland. I don't have to tell an American audience, and I didn't come to talk domestic politics, and I will not, that this is not a settled problem among Americans. And there are differences of view, and each party argues its case. And that in itself is disruptive of efforts to bring about a solution, in my view. But it is not something that appears yet to be one of those persuasive arguments which will swing American attitudes in one direction or another in terms of where things will go. It is true that I think the bulk of the countries in the world community have tended to favor Ukraine as the aggrieved, invaded, aggressed against party. And that is in itself an important and significant addition to Ukraine's capacity to continue the battle. If I had to make a bet, I wouldn't. Because I do not yet see the signs, despite the confidence-building measures that have already taken place, which I've just discussed, on prisoners, on food grain, on nuclear questions, and so on. I would hope that they will move in that direction, but I do not yet see the breakthrough. I see a very strong reason for the United States to continue to support the Ukrainians in their effort to defend their country and take back their land. But I do not hold out the hope that there is some kind of silver bullet solution down the road that will make all of that come to pass in anything like a time period that will have a major life-saving effect on those who will have to go to battle for their country. And the Ukrainians have certainly shown their willingness to do that. I think that I've done what I can to convey the consternation on my mind about these difficult problems and the current period. The fact that you have come and are willing to donate money to help Ukraine pleases me, and it's something that I warmly welcome, as I know all the sponsors do tonight, and thank you for doing so. And I will now, with enthusiasm, step down from this platform and take my seat and hope that I could give you a little more celerity in answer to your questions. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Joseph Varga. I'm born in Hungary, and I grew up under Soviet occupation. And when I was a small child, I believed all the propaganda we were told about the great Red Army, that they came. They are there to protect us, and posters and movies were showing them handing out food, and they're taking care of the people. But as I start growing up, I hear stories from my family, my parents, and older people, and they were telling me a whole different story that I learned in school. Or so some of them were that when the Russian came to Hungary during World War II, the young woman had to be hidden in attics and haystacks because they were raping people, and whatever the Germans, when they were retreating, were not taking from Hungary, the Russian came, took it. And my father told the story about 3 Russian soldiers that were quartered at her house. My grandparents were very poor and had 11 children, so the Russian who stayed there, they took all the beds, so the children and my grandparents have to sleep on the floor. They even took all the pillows, used some of them under their head. Some of them, they put their boots on it. And when my grandmother tried to take it from them, they point a gun at her to, don't do that. So basically, every time they wanted to, they didn't speak the language, so anytime they wanted to do something, they just pointed a gun at her, make her do something that they wanted her. And even when she cooked the meal, they eat first, and after that, whatever's left, family could have it. So there's a lot of sad story, but there was one story that my father told over and over when people came over. It was a little bit funny because the soldiers told my grandmother to make some tea, and she had all beat up pots, so she started making the tea, but they pointed at one almost brand new, shiny, coated pot on the floor. They wanted their tea there. So she told them it's not for that, but they insisted, so she made the tea. My grandparents don't have indoor plumbing, so with all the children, she had a bath pan, and that was the prettiest pot. So so I heard that story over and over because my father was very happy to tell, but he had to be careful who he tell, because there was, even in our family, there were some informers. So when he told the story, he could not just tell anybody because it could have been turned in. So I eventually left Hungary and started a new life in the US. And I thought I left everything, all this behind me until February 24, 2022, when one morning I woke up. I know it was coming, but I thought maybe it's not, there's a reason, there's a chance for Ukraine not to get invaded, but when I turn on my phone and I see Russian vehicles rolling through the Ukrainian border, it's almost everything came back. I have no relation to Ukraine. I have no relatives. I don't speak Ukrainian. But I felt like it was my own country that got invaded. So from that point, I decided I have to do something, whatever I can. So we made 3 trips so far to Ukraine. The first one was just a short one, and we established some connection with volunteers in Ukraine. But the last 2, we traveled around. We stopped shortly in Lviv, Kyiv, and Odessa, and stayed in western Ukraine. And we did a lot of things. We met a lot of nice and very friendly volunteers. Made a lot of friends. I made more friends in the last 2 years than I did all of my life. And we donated for many different causes, even for soldiers, not lethal weapons, but clothing, medicine, and even some medical treatments. And like in Kyiv, we donated money for a large school that they had to put some carpeting and fix up the shelter for the children. I think they train the children that take about 6 minutes after siren goes off to make it to the basement. But they were sitting there for hours with just cement flooring. So we donated. So many causes we did, but to me, it's the most important one is the visit with or help we give some orphanages. There's in Western Ukraine, Munkachevo, the town in Munkachevo, there's 4 orphanages that we have donated. To me, it's very important because when I was living in Hungary, myself also spent 3 years in orphanages, and I remember when we went out to the town, I see other children walk around. They had ice cream, lollipops, balloons, and we were fed, but we never get any of those. So right now with our trip to Ukraine, we make sure when we see the orphans, we threw pizza party, we bought them ice cream. And this last trip, we even paid for a whole day bus tour. They went to a cheese factory, had a nice dinner. Even at the dinner, they told us we could save some money if we get a cheaper meal, but I told them we can't do any shortcuts. So we finished up at the deer sanctuary, but even during every time the kids get off the bus, we put some stuff on like candies or glow sticks on their seat when they came back, so each time they got something surprise. And that wasn't even all of it, because it's still coming. We already prearranged Santa Claus for them to come, and then we'll St. Nicholas Day, we'll distribute them goodie bags. But I would like to finish my speech on, like I said, we met so many nice persons, so many people that volunteers, that they, young and old, that they supporting the soldiers and needy. Like the person I want to mention from all of this is Mary. She's Bosenka. She's a school teacher. She's working as a school teacher. So she has her own children, the class, but she look after 4 orphanages. One of them is a special need. One is in a distance, so she just send the money, but 2 other ones are local in Munkachevo. And one of them was from, children was brought over from a war zone from Dnipro, the town of Dnipro River. But she also looking after domestic displaced people, refugees, in a refugee center where she look after the children and the adults, and that's still not all, because she collects goods to the mothers of the soldiers who came to her, and they take this warm clothing and thing home, so when their sons come on a leave, they could give it to them, and they take it back to the front line. So basically, I want to mention just one of the many people we met, and they all they're really dedicated to what they're doing, and they just started this. And I noticed that when they know we are from the United States, they really cheer up, and they really appreciate it that we stick with them. But their biggest fear is that we may abandon them, and we're not going to be there for them. And because they believe that long as the help coming, and long as most of the democratic world is standing in Ukraine, they will succeed. I mean, at least the people we have talked to. So I'm going to give over the word to Kenneth.
I have a timer here. It's one of my biggest weaknesses, that I don't know when to stop talking. I used to have a 1-hour tour, then it became a 90-minute tour, then a 2-hour tour, now it's a 2.5-hour tour, and sometimes I go over. But that's another night, another story. Joseph inspires me, and so do a lot of other people. When Joseph came down that morning and wept in the living room, there was really nothing to say. The Russian army was just days away from capturing Kyiv. The story there was a little bit more nuanced. They had 150 javelins, and soldiers sacrificed their lives and held off a column of Russian tanks with their lives in 150 javelins. As I prepared to go for a second trip to Ukraine, and people here in this community, friends, began to ask me about the trip, they also began to help me understand why we were going. We received a lot of encouragement from Tim Jenkins and Linda Dini Jenkins. Began to frame it in the sense that this was something that needed to be understood if we were going to do it. And I began to understand it in terms of Colonel Timothy Pickering. Colonel Timothy Pickering wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson, President Jefferson. Pickering was concerned. We were about to turn our backs on Haiti, who had established a democracy, and instead, give our allegiance to the French. He warned that a president should not be in the pocket of a foreign government. And he said that Haiti is in possession of independence, which eventually became a line I used a lot in Ukraine with people. Ukraine, already in possession of independence, to remind them that we also understood and didn't wish to abandon them. A friend early on called Joseph one day on his lunch break, someone on Facebook, the magic of Facebook, a Ukrainian-Hungarian, Tibor. And he said, what is this interest in Ukraine? Well, he says, I'm coming back to Ukraine. Who? When? Who's Kenneth? And we had a phone call. The power of the internet lasted over an hour. And Tibor said, when I had said something about the money we were bringing, much of it ours and some of it other people's too, quite a bit of it eventually. And Tibor said, please do not mistake why you're coming. The money is okay. I have more than one house. I don't need your money. We have billions of dollars coming in. We got plenty of money. Your money isn't that important. However, the psychological support you'll give when you arrive, that's what we don't have enough of. We need your psychological support. If you can remember that, if you'll remember that, then you'll know what you're doing. So we came with an idea we would support good things, like the orphanage, many things that Joseph had chosen. A woman who made meals that were packaged and autoclaved, and she made them with 25 other women volunteers in a small village. An hour and a half travel for us if we wanted to see her. And they were sent to the front lines at Bakhmut, to the fighters who found these portable meals very handy to put in their pockets when they didn't have time to cook anything. Home-cooked dinners. And we supported Irina with $600 in June, and again when we went this last time. And so Tibor had said to us, psychological support. My mother, who passed away many years ago, and I love her, Jeannie Glover, she said, never go to a party without a party piece. You have to entertain people. You have to hold your weight at a party. And when we went this first trip, before anyone really knew we were going, we ran into these group of people, volunteers, we gave some money, and we got invited into the building behind. And it was our first contact. We met a group of women who were on a third floor of an old hotel, weaving camouflage nets for the soldiers, their sons and husbands who were fighting in the front line so they wouldn't be seen from the sky. And I wanted to do something. I felt awkward. We'd given money, now we're seeing these people's private lives. What can I do back? This is an uneven exchange. It's money. It's not right. It's not why we were there. And so I asked if I could sing. I said, what are you going to sing? I don't know how to sing very much, but I sing Puritan psalm songs from the 1640s. And I find they do very well in Ukraine. They're very religious, you know. So I stood there and the group of women stopped weaving the nets for a while. And I explained the song, Psalm 128. I don't have to explain to you, many of you all speak English. But, you know, I'd like to share that. I'm going to share it, because the acoustics are not too bad in this hall. I want you to hear what they have heard. And the other commonly asked for song when I go back, because I now have a repertoire and people have their favorites over there, is Sam Sham and the Pharaohs, Hey There, Little Red Riding Hood. They call it wrongly opera. But here is Psalm 128, which I've shared with many Ukrainians. Blessed is everyone, blessed is everyone that doth Jehovah fear, that doth Jehovah fear, that walks his way along, that walks his way along. For thou shalt eat with cheer, thy hands' labors, blessed shalt thou be, it well with thee shall be therefore. Thy wife like fruitful vine shall be by thy house side. The children that be thine like olive plants abide about thy board. Behold, thus blessed the man doth rest that fears the Lord. Jehovah shall thee bless from Zion, and shalt see Jerusalem's goodness all thy life's days that be, and shalt view well thy children then with their children. Peace on Israel. So I sang that, and the women began, some of them, to weep. I held it together. Another person sang, Ivan Kravchuk, who's an internet sensation, X Factor Ukraine. He sang, he was there. It was a real concert. And then I went downstairs to see, I didn't know it was where the women slept, the same room, identical below, this one with pallets of wood and thin mattresses and a few children's toys here and there. 60 beds of people who previously had full lives, now reduced to a pallet of wood and a thin mattress. And I wept. I didn't know what to do. It was terrible. It was the first time, although I identify as a Quaker, that I truly felt like I understood war. So the words come back that Tibor said to me. He took us one day when we made it to Kyiv for a 270-mile trip around the villages near Kyiv that had been under actual occupation. I bring you some of those stories. Here is just a few short, brief images. Fences, metal fences, and in different villages near Bucha. 50 children were executed. Near Bucha, there was a woman named, I don't know her name, Borodyanka is the town, and a woman gives me one of the last possessions that survived a Russian bombing of the apartment building she lives in. I didn't understand at first what I was seeing. She held in a park as the sirens were blaring because we were being told to get to shelter because we were only 20 miles from the Belarusian border, and there were planes up in the sky and there was a potential of bombing. We stood in the park and a woman approached us. She held this icon of the Holy Family. There's a few small coins, which may have for a moment made me think she was begging. I didn't treat her like that, but I later found out the coins of no value whatsoever. It's a custom, Tibor said, for friends to give each other a small token of gratitude sometimes when they meet or have a favor to ask. People had placed coins in the holy icon in the frame just simply to acknowledge her presence. She pointed to the building she once lived in. The whole center section crashed out by a missile. The Russian missiles have 2,000 kilos of explosive. 30 grams of it is enough to destroy a car. And when the building was leveled in the center, the neighbors are not allowed to dig through the rubble to save their neighbors. They were told they would be killed if they attempted to. They were under occupation. And she handed me the icon. I tried to not take it. Tibor says, "You must accept the gift. You cannot turn it down." She said, "Bring it back to America." She'd never met any Americans. And she says, "Bring this back to America. This was from my apartment. It survived. And say thank you for your help." We passed through another village, and this time there was a bakery from the 1800s that had once made a beautiful, sweet-tasting bread. And during the occupation, a Russian soldier, identified as someone from Siberia. We love our Siberian friends too. I'm not down on the Russian people. And the Siberian soldier was asked by a villager, "Why did you do it?" They had gone into the bakery, a bakery that had survived World War II under German occupation. They had considered it a cultural place, so they didn't touch it. And not that there could be many great things said about, nothing really, about the German armies in World War II. And they killed all 40 employees on the floor of the bakery and all of the owning family, and left everyone who had any institutional memory of the baking the bread dead. And the Siberian soldier offered up the explanation that eating Ukrainian bread is dangerous. From now on, you will only eat Russian bread. It's an attempt to stamp out their culture. We can have one happy story, because there's pictures there of the orphans, and they're on a trip to the cheese factory. There was a woman named, because I'm sort of closing my remarks now, Jane Addams, who was part of the settlement movement, Hull House in Chicago. And she said something to the effect that adults need water, shelter, safety, and hope. But children don't need hope. It's adults that need hope. Children need delight, which is what Joseph understands. Hence ice cream and pizza parties and a day-long outing. And on November 23rd, 2023, I had a tour in Salem. I was not going to celebrate Thanksgiving. I hate turkey. I hate the menu that's prescribed in the day. And I gave a tour to a Native American woman around Salem. And I was going to go home and cook a soup in the backyard on the open fire. That didn't happen. I'm not sorry. And Joseph said, check out Facebook, there's a message. There it is. The Children of the Trust Orphanage in Makachevo, just outside of it. They're wishing us a happy Thanksgiving, a happy American Thanksgiving. And they wanted us to know that they were buying their feast that day with the money that had been given to me by First Friends of Indiana, a Quaker group with stipulated nonviolent purposes. A wonderful woman named Lois who lives downtown, others. And we gave, this is not for the outings, just for the food itself, $2,500, which is not insignificant in Ukraine. And they were celebrating a one-year anniversary of being evacuated from Dnieper along the front lines. They were evacuated on November 23rd, 2022. And they wanted us to know they were celebrating Thanksgiving with us because they had their own reason to celebrate. But here's the rest of the story. On November 24th, 2022, a day after they were evacuated, while they were on a multi-day journey to their new home, a very powerful Russian missile, with guidance, targeted and struck the orphanage and obliterated everything. The good news is no human being was there. It was an empty building. The people targeting may not have known that. They've been shown to be cynical. Back to the village, my final point. We drove through and there was some writing on one of the fences perforated by shrapnel in a town that had been occupied. And it said, in a language I can't read, but it was translated, "People are here." They had been told in the village if they congregate in one house or compound, they could be careful not to have them harmed. As they left, they shot into every front window of every house. And when they came to the place where people were gathered because they were told they would be safe, they walked in and executed everyone before they left. These are the tales that I have, and people say, when we go, thank you for coming. You do know that it's dangerous, they say. It says, we have that sense that it's dangerous. They don't really wait for the answer. They say, thank you for coming. We think there's hope if you are here. I do want to blame one person who's not here tonight, because he's somewhere home, This envelope came to us at the very beginning of all this. We'd made one trip. It says Ukraine for Krampus, or Ukraine via Krampus. I dress up as Krampus once a year and give away crappy presents in Salem, doing it again on Saturday on Essex Street. And this man sent $220 in an envelope with his daughter, Carolyn Ross, and said, "I know you'll know what to do with it." Charlie Stepanak, a retired military veteran, he knew that we had things to do in Ukraine before we knew we had things to do in Ukraine. And we matched the funds, and we bought a washing machine for a group of internally displaced people who are now our friends and threw me my 53rd birthday party when I was there. I think I've used all the time that was allotted to me. I'm open for conversation afterwards. Thank you.
Might need your help, Michael. No, I got it. Okay. And now for the Q&A portion. Yasmin, I don't know how. Welcome. You were introduced before, but you didn't hear it. But you know who you are. Oh, you did hear it. Oh, good. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to turn this part of the program over to you. I'm sure audience members will have questions as well. And this will be the mic that the responders will use. So you win.
I'll hold it until I have to relinquish it.
Well, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me here this evening. I have to say, one of the reasons I am here, if you don't know me, I'm Yasmin Vossoughian. I'm an anchor for MSNBC. One of the reasons I'm here is one of my very dear friends, Nina Pickering, and I went to boarding school together. And I remember at one point, many decades ago, when she told me, because we've known each other since we were about 14, that she was related to Ambassador Pickering. I did not believe her. Because, as all of you know, he is certainly a giant, that is for sure, in the world of diplomacy, and I've known his name and of him for a very long time. So it is such an honor to be leading this Q&A with you, Ambassador, and to sit beside you up here today, and the knowledge that you have to share. And by the way, I did overhear as we were driving here that you are not optimistic about the Israel-Hamas war, although I will be asking you a little bit about that this evening. You will not get away from me with that. And Kenneth and Joseph, thank you too as well for sharing your stories, and I think it's really fascinating for us to be able to get into some of what you've experienced, and especially the need that is on the ground in Ukraine. I think especially as aid is held up right now in Washington because of the dysfunction of Washington right now trying to unseat a New York Congress member, the importance that this aid has for Ukrainians on the ground and for people like you that are providing the psychological support, as you say, to so many of these Ukrainians in need that are at war. Ambassador, I want to start with you, and if you don't mind, I'd love to, because it is my job, I can't get away without asking a couple of questions of my own, and then I'll open it up to you all to ask some questions as well. Ambassador, the question that I have been asking from the very beginning is the off-ramp. And it's a question that I'll ask about Israel and Hamas, so start thinking about that. But let's start with Ukraine and Russia. And while we in the media are very focused on what's happening in Israel, just over the last 24 hours, there was an apartment bombing in Ukraine with civilians killed. The war is still very much ongoing. And the best thing that could have happened to the Russian president was the war between Israel and Hamas. He is celebrating in Moscow tonight over what has taken place since October 7th. Talk to me about what you foresee as the off-ramp between Ukraine and Russia, if in fact there is one, that sees Ukraine, quote unquote, winning this war if they can.
Yasmin, thank you very much. I attempted in my remarks, but let me try to make this clear, to try to define a little bit of that. I think until the flow of events in connection with the conflict moves decisively in one direction, there is unlikely to be a pickup on the question of can we turn the conflict now toward a negotiated outcome. The other alternative to that is if we have a stalemate and neither side believes it can gain significantly by continued wastage in fighting, can it be persuaded by outsiders that it's better to start a negotiation to see whether it can find an answer? Those are the two pieces that I think have any potential for producing an off-ramp.
Is Vladimir Putin
I have to-
persuadable?
Could I just say one
Yeah,
other thing?
please.
And address that question? I don't see us getting close to that. And I see Putin, but I also see President Zelensky very resistant to the notion that they should engage in a negotiated outcome when the conflict has set the leverage in any negotiation so firmly against their gaining any kind of objective that they're likely to undertake it. When the objective becomes survival, that may shift. But we've looked at endless war, and we've been engaged in two ourselves, and have not been able to bring either the Iraq conflict to a successful conclusion or the Afghan conflict to a successful conclusion. We chose to get out of the Afghan conflict. I think it was the right answer, despite the fact that it was a very, very difficult, uncertain, and chaotic situation. I think that we should never have gone into Iraq in the first place.
You and a lot of other people.
And we can argue that up and down and sideways.
Yeah.
But I have to share my honest view, and that therefore getting out of the Iraq conflict is something that in one way or another, the balance of interest weighs in favor of, if I could put it that way. But dealing with the consequences of both conflicts has not been easy in terms of where we are. So Putin is against, I think President Zelensky is against at the moment. I don't know yet whether that will change in the next period of coming years. I'm somewhat doubtful that it will. I do think there is some hope that if the international community becomes much more firmly wedded to the idea that the conflict must stop, it's in everybody's interest to stop it, we may have a chance, similar to the holiday in fighting that has been negotiated with respect to the conflict in the Middle East. Whether that can be turned into a positive outcome or not, I do not know. I just think there are too many uncertainties to sit here and tell you something that I cannot yet see clearly how we get through. I finally think that were the U.S., maybe with other leaders of the international community, prepared to get behind an outcome that was generally acceptable to at least the bulk of the international community. And that would probably be an outcome favorable to Ukraine regaining the territory it lost. We may have a chance, and that's
But Putin would never
a third
accept that
option.
outcome.
What?
But Putin would never accept that outcome.
Putin would not. And the really interesting question would, what would the Russian public do?
Right.
And would it then move? I had a long talk with a very well-placed Russian who's taken refuge in the United States yesterday. And he agreed with me that Putin would not move under currently foreseeable circumstances in that direction. You're entirely right.
So when you say the Russian public, and I'm going to get to you too in a second, when you talk about the Russian public and what they would do, are you inferring that you think there could be a possible domestic uprising in Russia? And I say that because obviously the biggest threat that we have seen throughout this conflict on Putin's power and grasp of power was the advance of Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner mercenary group, who is now dead, unsurprisingly, who then backed off after having had, an agreement made by, helped by the Belarusian president. Are you saying that, like Yevgeny Prigozhin's advance on Moscow, it would have to be more of a domestic uprising amongst Russians that could ultimately change Putin's mind?
I think you're leaning in the direction that I think could be more likely, maybe less, put it this way, less clearly seen to have immediate impact.
Right.
And I go back to my time in Russia when the mothers of the soldiers fighting in Afghanistan on the Russian side began to gather in significantly large numbers with demonstrations that had more effect on the Russian public than I think we realize. And that began to plant a seed that it was time to get out of Afghanistan. And as you know, over a period of time, that resulted in Soviet withdrawal. Now, Putin is a very hard nut to crack. Would Putin have to be replaced? He's hard enough of a nut to think that he would not move on his own, and replacement might be there. I do not see, however, Russia putting itself in a position where military force and civil war will solve this problem. The Russians went through a civil war in the 1920s, but enough people are around who know the history to know what a bloodbath that was. And as a result, and I was in Russia in October 3rd of 1993, when there was a street revolt, mainly by hardline people who wanted to use more force. But it shocked the people of Russia. And in many ways, they look at that particular event, October 3rd, 1993, as a situation that got them close to civil war, and they don't want it. So that is more reprehensible for the Russian public, unfortunately, than the continuation of the present conflict in Ukraine. Will it shift the other way? It could, with a large amount of public support. I do not see the organizational impulse to get that, and I finally see the Stalinist security system that's in place in Russia strong enough to fight that, and willing enough to fight that if they see Russia getting to the edge of a civil war.
We're going to talk about Israel in a moment, so start thinking. And for all of you, start coming up with your questions. I'm going to pass it off to you in a moment as well. Joseph and Kenneth, Joseph, you talked about a little bit about your own experience as a child in Hungary and what it was like to be a victim of Russian aggression, and how you felt as if you were Ukrainian in essence, watching Putin's aggression on, or advance on, I should say, on Ukraine. If you will, what is it like to be in war as a child? What scar does that leave you and the people that you have been visiting with in Ukraine?
Well, I'm most of my, I mean, I didn't grow up in war, but I heard from my parents, and I even when I was in school in Hungary, we had a school project that, because it was an anniversary of I think in 1975, when they called the Russians, then when they came to as a liberation of Hungary, so we had to go out to talk to people who lived during the war and tell good stories about Russian general came to Hungary, but they all was telling us a story that they came to the house, they shot Pickering, the capitalist, and they took everything everything they could. So, and like even my father was telling a story that when the POWs was coming to, bringing them from Germany during
Right.
World War II, if some of them escaped, the Russian went into the village and they just grabbed a couple of men, and even my father was pulled into, because they were too afraid to tell their their superior that they lost POWs, so they just grabbed villagers, and my father was grabbed too. He was able to escape. But all these stories came back, and when Ukraine got invaded, I just felt like all these things came back, and I know what they're capable. So it's I don't know what it is. I have no connection to Ukraine.
Right.
I know they were part of the Soviet Union, but I know what's going to come. Even before Bucha, he could tell you. I came down. I'm past 60 years old, but I break down because I know all the, and sadly it came through all the atrocities and everything. Thousands of people dead.
I'm sure many of you remember Bucha was the city in which the Russian army had pulled out of after not being able to surround the capital city, and what was left behind was just thousands and thousands of murdered Ukrainians, their bodies left naked in the streets by Russian soldiers. It's interesting that you talk about the kind of generational scars. This is something we've talked a lot about, especially with what's going on between Israel and Hamas. And it seems as if that is something that you have carried. Maybe you didn't necessarily experience firsthand, but something that you've heard from your father's own experiences in World War II that still sits with you, despite the fact that you didn't see it with your own eyes, and something that many Ukrainian children will likely feel for the rest of their lives.
And like I said, the orphan part is because my father was an alcoholic, so I ended up in the orphanage too. But yeah, it's just, when I was growing up, I actually believed, because we were taught that Ukrainians are just like the Soviet, that they voluntarily joined the Soviet Union. They
Right.
were not occupied by Russia. And you know, when everything break up, and I see when Ukraine became independent, and I see just a few days after the war began, the people were lining up, volunteering to fight the Russians, and they were making a Molotov cocktail. They had no weapons, but they were ready to face off with the tanks. And hearing thousands, I believe right now Ukraine have the largest female volunteer army. There's supposedly 62,000 women sign up to fight. So just that determination, they for a short period of time, they had independence, and they don't want to give it up, and they were willing to fight. So I think just seeing the first few days of even Zelensky said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition, that this determination is really, really, I mean, for me, that's what really made it that I don't speak a language. Like when we go to Ukraine, we have to have a translator, but I feel like it was my own. Maybe because I grew up on the Soviet Union, occupied by Soviet Union in Hungary, that I feel their pain, or I can see
you resonated with what they were going through. And Kenneth, you talked about the psychological aid that is needed. They're getting billions of dollars. They have been continuously. Yes, it's held up in U.S. Congress. That likely will go through maybe in January, depending on whether or not they decide to get their act together. Nonetheless, what does that psychological aid look like? You talked a little bit about it. You touched on it. You sang that beautiful song for us. What does it look like for them? How important is it for Ukrainians to survive this?
Well, the psychological assistant often goes hand in hand with handing over cash to someone, not anyone, but a volunteer, and saying, I see your work, I see what you're doing, and we want to help with it. We want to give you funds so you can make trench candles for the soldiers, go pick up medicine for children. We gave money for children for the children's ward in Odessa Hospital. We gave $500, match something of a friend, for a field hospital in the front lines. And the psychological assistance is, you've supported some people's work over 2 visits to Ukraine, and they take the chevrons off of their uniform and they hand them to Joseph, or both of us. It's supporting people on the ground, their work, who, when you give them the money, sometimes it's spent within days because they already have a profound need. Or driving to someone's village at 10 o'clock at night and not getting home till 3 in the morning because you sat around their kitchen table eating and talking, and the soldier sitting across from you that you've just paid for his dental work because he was a prisoner of war by Wagner Group, and they took 16 of his teeth out with pliers. And we went with the $13,500 that I raised in tips in October on my tour, and we gave it to the director of Uzhgorod Hospital and the dentist who's doing the work right now. And as he's sitting, and he comes with us that night to that village, our car breaks down, and he has a military vehicle half a mile away. So we jump in the military vehicle, and then we're at this little village of Irina's house, and she serves the soldier borscht. And suddenly he speaks up and he says, "I've tasted this borscht before. I tasted this borscht when I was on the front lines in Bakhmut." And Irina says, "That's because my ladies and I made the borscht. We're the ones who made the borscht."
Wow.
And 2 people who never should have met suddenly are in the same room. And that's a psychological support where you just get people together and just do the thing that I think we're good at, is just being human.
To the Ukrainians that you've been speaking with, Kenneth, when you're there on the ground, I know you've made 3 visits there. Despite what all the analysts say and the conversations that we have in the media and what we hear from Zelensky and his aides, although Zelensky feels as if he will win, and they will not stop till they win, do they feel as if they will win? Do they feel as if the world is behind them?
This is an easy answer. There's a chevron patch over in the display case, and in Ukrainian, and it was given to Joseph and I by a soldier who we helped out, who's disabled. And he brought us the chevrons, and it says in the chevron, "Liberty or death." And that's what they're framing it in. If they can't have liberty, they're willing to die.
It's incredible. When the war began, I remember I was anchoring the night that the war began. We were on air all night, and every analyst was saying 48 hours, Putin's army will be in the capital, Ukraine will be overtaken, and we are still in this war. Many months later, and that certainly did not happen. And I think part of, and the analysis that we often have is because of the conviction of the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian people, along with the aid that they have gotten from the United States and others, has really helped drive the success they've had on the battlefield, despite what we all thought was a strong Russian military. I'm coming to you soon, I promise. But I got to ask you, Ambassador, as we are in the midst of this Israel-Hamas war, and I know you don't have a lot of optimism, one of the questions that I have been asking consistently, and I just would love to hear from you, as former ambassador to Israel, U.S. ambassador to Israel, is yet again this off-ramp, this idea of an off-ramp, but in a different way. We know, the world knows, is watching this conflict and this war, and Hamas needs to go. They have not held a quote-unquote democratically held election since 2006. Whether or not that was democratic is another conversation. The atrocities that were leveled against the Israelis on October 7th cannot be denied. They are atrocious. As we look ahead to the day after this war ends, and you have Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in power in Israel, how do you foresee that power structure going in that day after? Netanyahu has said indefinitely they will have security over Gaza. Do you think that is a good decision on his part? And do you think that both Israel and Gaza can live safely, Israelis and Palestinians can live safely alongside each other with Netanyahu still as prime minister?
A lot of people I met with in the last week, when I sat down with both Palestinians and Israelis, interestingly enough, in the same room, thought that there could not be a durable peace settlement with Netanyahu in charge. But none of them had a formula for how to achieve that objective. And the objective would be achievable only through an Israeli election that brought to power an alternative coalition based on the people who were not part of the Israeli extreme right. And I was ambassador there in, trying to think, 1988, 85 to 88.
Yeah. I did my research.
You didn't. You're way ahead of me.
Nina told me to.
And my feeling was that because of the deep uncertainty that Bibi has exploited, and he's an extremely gifted politician, he's moved the center of gravity of Israeli politics to the right. And I haven't said this to a public audience before, but I have said it privately to audiences of people who are steeped in the Middle East and experts, but I'll say it here. The Israeli right is clearly moving in the direction over time, and it may be a long bit of time, to carrying out the prediction and indeed the objective of a man from Poland by the name of Jabotinsky, who came to Israel in the 30s and who believed that Israel's future could only be secured by having a country free of Arabs, either from the Euphrates to the Mediterranean or from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. And I'm afraid that that's now much more closer to a stated objective, but it will take quite a bit of time to achieve it if it's going to be put in place. And will Israelis, as a result of the current situation, change their view? Not in the short term, maybe in the longer term, but it is just like the Ukraine-Russia question, an extremely hard question to predict, very uncertain, likely to be only realized in what are a series of unpredictable developments that force on the public the notion that military victory is not a certain solution to these conflicts. And therefore, at a certain point, one has to turn the military question toward the diplomatic outcome.
Right. Okay, last one. And then I promise, I promise, last one. I asked, do you know Richard Haass? He's former head of the Council on Foreign Relations. Anyways.
I know Richard Haass better than you know.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. Well, you paused, and so I was looking for the answer. I'm sure you do. Tell us that story. So I asked Richard Haass the other day on air, and I actually had Ambassador Dennis Ross on my show today, who I'm sure you know quite well as well. And so I asked him on air about what the president needs to be doing right now, the conversation President Biden needs to be having with, whether it be the Knesset, whether it be the Netanyahu administration, the prime minister, whether it be his party, whether it be Benny Gantz, the conversations that need to be had by the president, by Secretary Blinken, who is in Tel Aviv right now, about the future of Netanyahu's leadership. And Haass said to me, I believe now the president needs to go and stand over the Knesset and call for somewhat of the removal of Netanyahu. But to not go so far as to get involved in their domestic politics. Say this may be the best, but not to go so far as to get involved in their domestic politics. And I don't know where that line is. But when you're looking at a 2024 election and polling not going so great for the president right now, and the country divided over this war and U.S. support for this war, and the answer that you just gave to me about Netanyahu's potential future, and the fact that Netanyahu certainly got involved in our own domestic politics when Donald Trump was running for president and serving as president of this country, is it time for the president to get involved in what may be the future for Bibi Netanyahu and his leadership in Israel for a lasting peace?
And my answer to that is no,
Okay.
for two simple reasons. One, we have quite rightly a serious domestic cultural prohibition on trying to change governments which are working hard to achieve democracy even if they aren't quite there. And secondly, we have a serious deficiency in our efforts to change governments that are not democratic and have no interest
Yeah.
in becoming democratic.
Yeah.
And I can cite a number of cases where we have been abject failures
Yeah.
at doing that. And I think that it is extremely wise to draw lessons from those particular situations. Now, a great Secretary of State died yesterday.
Yes, I was going to ask you about
And
that
he
too.
was in one way or another entrapped in the theory that, excuse me, we had the capacity to change undemocratic governments and bring about a shift that was in our interest and that we, in our own exalted decision-making power, decided was in the interest of the people of the country. And the answer to this, as hard as it is that doesn't work. What does work is when people in the country take into their hands the necessity to change the government, and we hope that it is not by force and disastrous massacre, but by voting. We cannot assure it. This is a very uncertain proposition. But I have no objection to us being totally in favor of democracy everywhere around the world and to doing every legitimate thing in international law
Right.
to promote it. But I have a real sense of reservation, deep reservation, on the basis of what I have seen in 40-some years of exposure to American activities inside, that we are not very good at doing that, and most people are not either.
No.
And it is not a good way for a democratic country to run its foreign policy, despite the fact that it leaves horrible circumstances in place in a number of countries around the world, which we would rather avoid, including really inhumane treatments. So we do what we can. We work to stay within the law. We certainly encourage people vocally, which we can do.
Right.
But the notion that we organize coup d'etat
Right.
and pick new leaders is beyond the pale, and I think we have to be very cautious about it.
Okay, now I'm opening it up to the floor. So should I walk the microphone around? Here you go. I feel like I'm Vanna White.
You're much better looking. This question is for the ambassador, and Ambassador Pickering. I am the proud husband of a Pickering, so you have made us proud over the last several decades. Thank you very much for your service to the country. I have two questions about the Middle East. One, the fact that the Hamas issue is really based upon an ideology which is underscored by their charter, and that is the total destruction of Israel. How do you define a win in the war, knowing that Hamas is not a traditional army, but more an ideology, number one? And number two, presuming that the Israelis, quote unquote, win the war, how do you see the format for the next government of the Palestinian state?
Those are good
Very
questions.
simple and easy questions. Thank you very much. I don't see a win in the war. And I see a war dedicated to somebody's view that anybody who is of a particular political ideology deserves to die without trial, without any justice system, without anything other than there he is, bang. And I don't know that in this particular effort there is any system for telling who is, quote, a bad guy and who deserves to live. So the notion that 1,200 Israelis were massacred is, in my view, horror in itself. And there is no excuse for that. But that is not, in my view, and I say this with the greatest care and with a good bit of torture for myself, an excuse to commit mayhem against Palestinians. I wish that there was a simple answer, but there is not. So the second question is there a Palestinian government that can take charge and move? In a very strange way, those of us who've been dealing with the region for a long period of time, and I just finished a 2-day meeting of people from the region, not dominated by Americans at all, that is struggling with this issue. In a strange way, the people who could best lead the Palestinians, in my judgment, are still in Israeli jails. And I don't doubt that they committed crimes that the Israelis were perfectly justified in punishing them for. I think the Israeli justice system, particularly the Supreme Court, which Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to change, is a remarkably good example of careful justice, carefully carried out. The problem is it is too remarkably good at that to Mr. Netanyahu to put up with. So secondly, is the present exchange of hostages for prisoners going to get to that point? We all know that when it comes to releasing males in military service, now hostage to Hamas or one of the other Palestinian organizations, the price will go up. And Hamas, in its own way, could achieve the release of people who might be persuadable that there is a chance for a peace settlement that could be carried out in a reasonable fashion. And certainly it would require a two-state solution, despite the fact that I've lived for 5 years with the chance the two-state solution is dead and it can never be revived. The two-state solution is back in vogue because anybody who thinks through the answer to this problem says you can't put one group totally in charge of two disputing groups and expect to have a peaceful future for the region they live in. It just doesn't work. And the only thing harder than the two-state solution is the one-state solution. And I've known that for a long time, having worked for 40 years on the problem. So we have to come around to that. Are we ready to begin to move in that direction? Are others willing to join us? We have lost a lot of prestige, persuasive power and position in the world for reasons that you can analyze as well as I, and I don't have to drag you through them. We still have an important position of persuasive power with respect to Israel. Will we use it on the verge of a 2024 election? Those are serious questions for us. We're a democracy. We live by elections, but at the same time, elections impose on a political system certain restraints on what people will do. Sometimes not so good, sometimes okay. And we have to live with that under the rules of the game that we have now and not going to change. But my view is that Israeli political change will not come easily. It will not come out of foreign persuasion. It will not be durable if we try, despite the fact that George H.W. Bush made some progress in that direction, but that was at a time when you had both a left and a right of nearly equal persuasive powers in the Israeli political system. That doesn't exist now. Could it come back? I don't know. One has hopes, obviously, that a democratic system will produce real options rather than one choice. But that's hope. That's not yet reality. So this remains an uncertain situation into which we must look. If other countries were prepared to join us in the international community, would that have some effect? I think it would. No country likes to be seen to be so totally isolated from the international community that it cannot exist in a community of nations, that it cannot trade, that it cannot conduct economic activities, that it is not received as an equal nation, and so on. Those particular factors are certainly hard to categorize in numerical terms, but they are not totally irrelevant as to how things go. So sometimes we have to put our hope in those kinds of activities, building what I would call diplomatic leverage for change. And it takes time, and it takes hard work, and it takes countries willing to stick their neck out, and it takes cooperation. And that takes leadership. If we are reduced in our leadership potential, can we get it back? I think so. I think in part there are a few others who are prepared to step forward and do the kind of things that we may have to do in one fashion or another. And I don't mean go in and take over with armies and occupy a country and then dictate the outcome. I mean using diplomatic persuasion and using what I would call positive leverage and some of the other things that have also shown they can have effect in changing outcomes. But I'm an idealist, and probably you don't want to listen further to me.
Interesting. Is this working? No, just go on. It's interesting how Ambassador Pickering said that the two-state solution, and it goes back to what Kenneth said a little bit earlier, which is what do people need the most in this world, especially during wartime? That is shelter, safety, hope. What do people not have right now in that region? Is shelter, safety, hope. Okay. Making my way back to you. Let's go to a lady next.
Americans known to have an attention span of a gnat. I'm just curious how we're going to keep Americans focused on the Ukraine situation. And my heart goes out to the Ukrainians because of that. So how do we get the conversation and the focus back on these people who are sacrificing their lives to stop Putin?
Who's the question to?
Any panel.
Who wants to take it? Anyone, anyone.
It looks like
Go ahead,
it's
Ambassador.
as much in my department as any. I have been struck by the degree to which the Middle East has, for the moment, taken Ukraine off the headlines. And I would be the last person, Yasmin, to put this at the feet of the press. Point made. Because in many ways, it's a harder problem. It involves a closer association with big powers with nuclear weapons. We've had the president of a very large nuclear power try to weaponize the threat to use nuclear weapons in a way that will somehow meet his objectives. And I think he's done a bad job. He's introduced a very, very dangerous precedent, and we need to be very attentive. And it is the one thing that I believe is imperative for us to try to resolve before elections, and regardless of the impact on elections, but I think any American president who can introduce greater elements of stability in the world nuclear equation deserves all of the political support he can garner by doing so.
It keeps going. Okay, there you go.
For the ambassador, at the time of the initial Russian invasion in 2014, there was a common belief that I heard that the linkages between the people in eastern Ukraine and Crimea with Russia were stronger than with western Ukraine. So my questions are, number one, was that true? Number two, if in some fantasy world it was possible to create a free and fair election in those areas, how would they come out? And is that a possible off-ramp in, say, a situation of a stalemate such as you have talked about? Thank you.
I would say this, that the prevalence of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine is understood and well known. I don't have a figure, but it is not a trivial percentage. The number of those people who side with the Russian military occupation is not trivial, but neither is the number of Russian speakers who are in the Ukrainian army and who support Ukrainian military rejection of the Russian invasion. Again, I do not know the numbers. I have, in an article I wrote in March of 2023, to try to touch on the question of where can we go and what are the options that could play a role, suggested that with respect to Crimea in particular, it would seem to me that the right question to ask is, what do the people of Crimea themselves wish to have with respect to their future governance? My view is that while Crimea had purportedly a preponderance of Russian speakers, until 1954, Crimea was part of the Russian Republic of the Soviet Union. It does not necessarily have a surefire result in favor of the Russians. Any referendum fails if, in fact, the people holding the referendum choose to push the answer in their favorite direction. So there has to be a system for holding a referendum under those circumstances that can let people speak freely. Crimea has minorities, Tatars, Ukrainians. that will certainly wish to participate in a vote, especially if it's seen as free and fair. And the one organization that has enough experience in carrying out those kinds of votes is the UN. But the UN, in my view, would have to have a substantial peacekeeping force presence unallied to either Ukraine or Russia to assure, in fact, that the voting was as free and as fair as you could make it. The problem is more likely to go in the Russian direction in the eastern oblasts, the eastern administrative regions of Ukraine, but I don't know how much, and I don't know how much the present Russian administration has antagonized people in that region or not. But I don't know of a fairer way to judge how can the people of a region or an area make a decision about what they want in the future other than asking them and giving them every assurance that they have a secret, free, and fair ballot. But that may be ideal. Nobody has come to me and said, you have the Nobel Peace Prize for making this suggestion.
Question for Ambassador Pickering, coming from a Bulgarian, Armenian, Macedonian, generational scarred viewpoint, which is very pessimistic. But in your estimation of this, and in lieu of, not in lieu of, but in honor of Kissinger's passing and his spirit of compromise, is there a compromise situation that you think is realistic where Zelensky makes some compromise, Putin makes some compromise? What would it be if it was possible? So another easy question.
Well, I mean, people have suggested, but both Putin and Zelensky, for their own reasons, have rejected those kinds of suggestions, that Crimea makes some kind of decision by referendum, and because there had traditionally been part of the Russian Federation until 1954 and may have a majority of Russian speakers, it would choose to go to Russia. I don't think necessarily that's the case, but I think President Zelensky has to be concerned that he is not prepared to have fought the Russian invasion only to roll the dice on the outcome. So these are the kinds of reservations and difficulties. And I don't believe it is up to the international community to say this piece of land should go here and that piece of land should go there. Woodrow Wilson tried it in 1918 and 1919 and divided up the Balkans, and you know, because you yourself have recited your legacy of the Balkans, it's a richness I haven't heard in any one person for a long time, but it nevertheless points up the fact that there are contentious players in the region who at the moment are not necessarily going to be satisfied by some diktat by a group of people sitting in New York at the Security Council, even with the best interests in the world. And I used to sit in the Security Council.
Hi. Hi, I'm Svetlana. So I originally from Dnipro, Ukraine, and I have a question for you, kind of different, because I have many relatives in Ukraine, and when war started, I moved them, some people in US, some people in Canada, some people in Poland. So my question different about the US senator, like it is a project about the give Ukrainian green cards who is here. So if you imagine people who moved from territory what is no houses anymore, they already here in US. What their future, what you think will be?
If I understood your question correctly, you said Ukrainians who left Ukraine in the face of the Russian invasion, have now come here?
Yes.
And
so
the question is,
by program United for Ukraine,
Yeah.
many Ukrainians came here, and that it's 2 years paroled program,
Yes.
right? And they already here. It's almost time, like clocking down that they going to do something, but they don't have houses anymore because that it's territory occupied.
so are you saying to me, are they going to be forced to go back to Ukraine?
No, they right now, like on the situation, they don't know what will be next.
Yeah. I think that the
Yes.
uncertainty.
I think she's asking about the uncertainty here in the United States for the Ukrainians that fled the war in Ukraine. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah,
And what could be next for them in obtaining green cards, visas,
Yeah,
to be able to stay and work?
My sense is this is, of course, up to the U.S. Congress, because the things you're talking about are subject to U.S. legislation. I, as a voter, but I'm only one voter under 300 and some million, would certainly support extension of parole, but also, if we're ready to make a decision, I would support a decision to offer green cards to people who are displaced, who can meet the general eligibility requirements for those. No special requirements one way or the other. And I would look at the question of whether, in fact, we should offer special visas for people who are bringing talents to the United States that we consider to be worth encouraging people to come for, H1, whatever they are, H1V or whatever that is, so that Ukrainians get absolutely the same fair treatment as everybody else. And for some refugee populations, we've offered shorter term time requirements to be eligible for a green card and then citizenship than which is standard under the law, helping them out because, in fact, they don't have any other place to go, and they are meeting the standards for citizenship. They've not been involved in activities that the U.S. would not wish to take them as citizenships for.
Last thoughts from Galena, who is Ukrainian herself, and she just wanted to share some thoughts.
There's also one person in there in the mask. The guy. Yeah, you can do. You can go before me. Thank you.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to.
Oh, okay. So we are running out of time, everybody. Let's get two more in, and then I'll end over with Galena. Here you go.
My name is Elizabeth Enfield. I'm from Gloucester, Mass. And a few years ago, maybe the last time they had an election with Netanyahu, I'd been to Israel. It was like a dream because my grandfather never got to go there. And I was a little bit surprised. I was not comfortable with the politics, but I met a lot of Arabs who were born there, and they did not look ferocious or anything. They were very helpful. And the last, I stayed in an Arab hotel or whatever, and the man offered a big room one night for the elections where women would go and learn how to vote, and the next night with men. And we talked, and the next day I had to leave. But had I known I was invited to go for breakfast, I would have done that because his wife came over and invited me, but my cab was there, and I was in Haifa, and it goes right to Tel Aviv, to the airport. What I experienced there, and that was the election that had come up, was that it was his fourth term that he had served, and he's not allowed to be president anymore. And then this time, they had a new president. Was this person purposely put there and then fired so that Netanyahu kind of slid in? He wasn't elected, but he gets in. I was just wondering about his facility of becoming the head of Israel again after that. But I am concerned about Hamas. I think they lay low for 20 years. I'm surprised that our detections here do not cover that and see what's happening, that they just came up as a surprise. And I really have enjoyed listening to you. You're incredible. You are very thoughtful. You really know the issues, and you're very calm and are leading us the right way to discern what you're talking about.
Did you want to comment on that?
Tudah rabah. That's Hebrew for thank you very much.
But the question was about,
Whether or not you slid in when the other person was fired because there was no election, right? Somebody took his place as president and not you. That's when trouble started again.
As far as I know, there is no direct election. I guess there is still a direct election for prime minister. So you can't become prime minister of Israel unless you're elected prime minister of Israel.
He was in his last term, and then he couldn't.
do you guys want to say something?
Yeah.
There was a brief time when they had a direct prime ministerial election, but it hasn't been that way for a while. Structure. Yeah.
One more? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Dick Jędrzejczyk, and about 10 years ago, in this hall, I heard somebody talk about petrostate and Putin's aggressive use of control of energy. Winter is coming. I would like to hear all three of you say, because I have seen nothing about it in the past 2 years, how does the gas flow out of Russia affect the coming winter?
Do I get that one too?
Well, I think he wanted to hear from all three of you about how the gas flow, i.e. heating in the winter times, the lack of energy, the fuel crisis that Ukraine was dealing with in wartime last winter as well. I could add on a little bit as well, but the three of you want to comment?
I don't know about individual states. I do know that European states, not necessarily Ukraine, have been encouraged to reduce their dependence on Russian energy, oil and gas.
And they've been incentivized to do so as well.
And they have been, and we have tried to incentivize it in order to obviously reduce the capacity of the Russian economy to carry the weight of the war. And that's an economic sanction that I think is probably permissible for countries to make.
Yeah.
I don't see it.
But China is still buying Russian oil.
So is India.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it doesn't stop it entirely.
Right.
And so I suspect Russia had accumulated $635 billion in reserves at the beginning of the war. 300 of that was neutralized by being in Western banks. And so they ended up with $335 billion to fight the war. They don't seem to have been in any way at all held back from doing that.
It's already snowing in Odessa. It's snowing in the mountains in western Ukraine. And I know the soldiers, their heat in the trench is a trench candle made of paraffin wax in an old tin can with cardboard. And one trench candle can heat 2 kettles of tea. And it's important that they be fairly smokeless, so they can't be found from the sky and targeted by drones. But people are heating with wood fires, and our experience when we were there the last time, as opposed to the first, was that they have light, they have infrastructure for energy, but of course there's places close to the front lines where energy is very interrupted. But they're doing better energy-wise our last trip than they were on our first trip.
Final thoughts?
Oh, yeah. Hi, my name is Galina, and I'm from the western part of Ukraine, Lviv. And I just wanted to tell you a couple of thoughts that I've had since, I've been in this country for 7 years, and my husband and I left Ukraine short after 2014, right when the war started, and it's a very emotional topic for me. I'm getting a very high anxiety from everything and all the talks, but I just wanted to thank you about your insights, about the work that you've been doing in Ukraine. This is very important. All that emotional support is extra important. People of Ukraine are very, very resilient. I don't know if people know the history of Ukraine, because I feel like the history here of Ukraine has been told by Russia for many years. And it's just that people didn't see Ukraine, didn't know where it was for so long, and people need to be seen and recognized. This is very important for Ukrainians, and that emotional support is very important. And just a quick personal story from my family. The western part of Ukraine, some of you probably know, is Ukrainian, you could say more Ukrainian than the rest of it, and there's a reason for it. It had the least amount of bad stuff coming from Russia, because the eastern part of Ukraine has been occupied for almost 300 years. And when we're talking about people in the eastern part speaking Russian, being my personal thought is they are brainwashed. They were brainwashed by Russia for so long because the media was Russian in that part, unfortunately, even during the independence time. So there was a big division between Western and Eastern Ukraine, but with the start of the war, things changed. Of course, there are people who are still believing in whatever Russia is selling them, but a lot of people who spoke Russian are starting to speak Ukrainian, and that is like a big deal for the whole country, because people have been told that Ukrainian language did not exist. Ukrainian was worse than Russian, and years and years of first, people were sent to Siberia for speaking Ukrainian, for saying that they were Ukrainian, I don't know if you know the Carol of the Bells, Person Leontovich, composer, who composed the version that everybody knows today. He was killed by a KGB agent, not even knowing what success that song had in the world. It's just that Ukrainians and Ukrainian culture have been targeted by Russia for so many years, and millions of Ukrainians were murdered, sent to Siberia, never to come back. And just thinking about how much pain, loss we've been through for a couple of decades, and now it's coming back, you need to understand that Ukrainians are very strong, very resilient, and what they need is to be seen and to be heard and not to be forgotten. And they need support, not only weapons, but emotional support. You've seen how many children were left without parents. They will need support. The whole generation is broken by this invasion that was not provoked, not called for. This is, again, extinction of a nation. And I, as a Ukrainian, would love to see the world to come together, doing a bit better job with standing up to this big bully. This is not okay. It's not okay for the world to just sit and do nothing. Because from my perspective, it is nothing. Sanctions, I'm going to land to an East European store, and there's a lot of Russian stuff, products. How do they come to the US? Why is the US, the country that is helping us the most, trading with Russia? What is wrong with this world? things need to get better, and I'm pleading, please, because so many lives are being lost every day, every minute. People who otherwise would work in tech, in design, in developing. People in Ukraine are not violent. People want to live their lives, sing songs, eat good food. That's what we've been doing for centuries. Like, give us ability to live, to enjoy life, to care for our families, to enjoy our traditions. That's what's important. Ukrainians are highly cultural people, smart people, who want to develop, not sit in trenches and die. Nobody wants to die. They're willing to defend their country, but nobody wants to die. This has to stop. We cannot talk about years and years more of war, negotiations. It doesn't happen. Like, who's going to negotiate? I feel like Ukraine has been forced to negotiate while we were shot at. Like, this is not possible to negotiate with a tyrant. So I'm begging anyone who could help, just help us end this politically, negotiating sanctions in whatever way is possible. And then emotional support is important. There's a lot of people who lost limbs, who lost family, and they will need a lot of support in coming years, a lot of years. And I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the work that you've done. This has been very emotional to see what you've been doing, and from the people of Ukraine, thank you so much.
Just a quick word. No, on behalf of Hamilton Hall, I'd like to thank the Pickering House and the Friends of the Broad Street Cemetery for allowing us the honor of hosting this experience. Thank you to all of you for attending. Thank you to our speakers, and especially thank you to these two for sharing their experience and the good work they're doing. A round of applause. Thank you.
And I'd like to thank you, the ladies of Dobros, a Ukrainian organization who've given us great help when we traveled to Odessa, made our travels safer. Thank you.